writer, a freelance editor. She also runs school readathons, which I think has something to do with her kids. She is editor-in-chief of the edgy Fault Zone anthology. Her writing has appeared in the Fault Zone books, also in the Sandhill Review 12, in Traveler's Tales from Spain, Transfer Magazine, and The Cupboard. Lisa has spent 7 years, she launched her publishing career in New York, where she worked as a children's book developmental editor for 7 years with Macmillan and a book packager whose books were, was presenting books for many, for various publishers in the industry, particularly the scholastic books. And her literary novel, The Siren Dialogues, is going to be published either late this year or very early next year by Sandhill Review Press. And one of her stories, excerpted from the novel, has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize. So thank you, Lisa, for being here today and being willing to be part of this interview.
Thank you, Darlene.
Tell us something about your novel, The Siren Dialogues. What is the storyline? What is the theme? Tell us something about the characters.
Okay, well, it starts with a woman who visits a barrier island off-season, and she's called there, she's had a knee surgery, so she's recovering from that. She's waiting for the connective tissue to meld with her body. She has a donor ligament, which comes from someone who's no longer needing it. And she's called more to this island by this voice of a siren and the island itself than by her boyfriend that she's visiting. So she goes out there, she's searching for some questions and answers about her past, and she kind of gets stuck. And then the narrator of the story sort of jumps in to get things moving and ends up getting sucked into the story and stealing her boyfriend and having to go on a quest to find her own answers and hearing the voice of her own siren. And it becomes this whole process of the characters being mixed together in this environment of the island. And the island is kind of a main character of the book. So there's themes of life and death that are running through it, and it's really about kind of the spaces in between things that this book is exploring. Is that a little bit of an intro?
Yeah, a very complex story and dealing with the imagination and the dream world. I mean, I get that impression from the couple of stories that I've read. Very intriguing kind of trip into the unconscious in a way, or into the parts of the world that we don't ordinarily live in. What was the inspiration for the novel? Why did you decide to write this story?
Well, it started as a short story, and most of the events in the original short story have changed, but one thing that stayed the same was there's a mermaid that washes ashore on this island, and who's just there briefly, but kind of gets things moving. And there's the other thing that really started me off was I was once on a similar island, kind of the basis of this island, and I was duck hunting. I'm not really a duck hunter myself, but I was out with people who were hunting. And there was a duck that was shot and fell into the boat, and it wasn't dead though, and its wings were flapping around, and the hunter was wringing its neck, but it kept looking up, and it was looking right into my eyes. And the guy had to wring its neck 3 times before it finally died, and I kept looking at this bird in between, and it was in this place in between life and death, and it was as if it was asking a question. So that image just stayed with me over years, and it's kind of the image that runs throughout the whole book, and trying to figure out what is it asking, and that becomes a part of that story with those characters.
You can see how that would inspire a story. I mean, it's a haunting image, and it haunted you. Did you find the story by the end of the book, or shouldn't I ask that question?
Well, the story is really about a lot of questions, and the questions lead the characters to different places without necessarily giving them definitive answers. But I did notice that in my writing, I'm kind of obsessed with that theme of that place between life and death, because I have another story that's published in Traveler's Tales Spain. It's called Toro Torero, and there's a bullfight, and in the fight, the bull is killed, but it's still standing. It hasn't actually died yet. And when I looked back at that, I'm like, oh, this seems to be kind of an obsession. I'm really trying to figure something out about this. In my process of trying to find out what that place is, it kind of generated this whole story.
An obsession that could generate quite a few stories.
Yeah.
More than one book, probably.
I hope that it's not the only theme I ever have, but it keeps cropping up.
Right. What was your writing process for this novel, and how long did it take you, and what kind of did you go through to get it from beginning to end, or from start to finish?
Well, I worked on it off and on for years. I'm not quite sure. I stopped counting after 7 because it seemed too embarrassing. Although I know a lot of people are counting 10 and up. I think mine is probably there by now. But what happened was I realized as I was writing I didn't have a lot of dialogue in the story. There was a lot of description, a lot of lyrical writing, very poetic stuff going on, but not a lot of dialogue. So I started to interview my characters and just to kind of get to know them better and see what they would say. And at some point things shifted and they started to interrogate me.
Wow.
So that was really interesting when that happened, and I just kind of went with it and dove into the story with them, and just, every writing session I would sit down, I wasn't sure who I was going to meet or what was going to happen, but it was really an adventure, so I just kept going with it.
That's great. It reminds me of a conversation I was having with Gary Turchin, who was one of the authors here earlier, and he said, you should never go where you think you want to go with your book. You should go where you discover you have to go. And it sounds like that's exactly what you've done.
It is, and what I found was that every time I got to a place that felt kind of uncomfortable, and I would ask myself, oh, maybe I shouldn't go there, that's not a comfortable place, I started to recognize that was exactly where I needed to be, so I would keep going into that place, and I started to become comfortable with the uncomfortableness of it.
Good for you.
Sort of comfortable anyway. Or at least I knew that that was kind of the moment that must be something real there. The parrot agrees.
I want to ask you a little bit about your experience with children's books. Sometimes writers in the audience are interested in that area. What does the development editor of children's books do? I mean, what is there to develop in a children's book? Let's put it right, get to the point.
Well, it was with mostly middle grade novels and series, and I worked for a book package, and we would put together books for the publishers, a lot of the big publishers in New York, Scholastic and Berkeley Books and Simon & Schuster, and we would do the books faster than they could do them and cheaper. So we would come up with ideas in-house and find authors to match up with them. And sometimes the authors would come with ideas, and we would just help them develop their ideas into a series or a 3-book series, and I had to kind of sometimes match up the authors with them or just help them develop them, or sometimes the authors would have their own stories already, and I would just work very closely with them, and I just loved the process of doing it. It was so much fun. I still love editing, as you know, because I've worked with you on your stories in the Fault Zone. So it's just a really fun process.
Well, there actually is editing to be done with children's books. I know.
There's a lot.
I think a lot of people think it would be so easy to write a children's book. Did you run into that kind of expectation with authors?
I did, and I did work with young picture books at the beginning of my career, and then I kind of moved up to middle grade and young adult after that, so it was a little bit different. But I used to read the slush pile for picture books, and it was amazing some of the things that came in, and people would send me their only copy and then call and be mad when I didn't have it. But I once got a story about clouds floating around in outer space, and I just kept thinking, the clouds have to be in the atmosphere, they can't be floating in outer space, and I just got stopped right there. I would get things like that, or people saying, well, I didn't see any books in the library on this subject, so I wrote one. And I have to say, but it doesn't quite work.
Right. Do you have any advice you would give to aspiring children's book authors in today's market?
I was actually just at a panel this morning with children's book authors speaking about the whole process. And I mean, always with any book, it's, what's the story arc, and does it have a good beginning and end? Does it go someplace? It's true for children's or adult books. And I think kids today are really a lot of them are looking for series. I mean, a lot of the books we grew up with were one novel, and today kids seem to expect a whole series, and they want them to come fast. They have to be once a year or faster, which is is kind of a crazy pace, and I question it sometimes, but kids seem to really want something that has a hook that will really draw them in and be a lot of fun to read. Gone are the days of long preludes into books where children could sit still for a long time. They just don't do that anymore. But there's a lot of really good stuff out there. So that's not very specific, but it's just sort of my general ideas about it.
Well, I'm sure that's helpful to people who might be interested. You're also the editor-in-chief of Fault Zone. How is editing an anthology different from editing another type of work?
It's more fun. I love editing in general, but with an anthology I get to work with a whole stable of writers, and the real joy in putting it together is choosing what pieces are going to work together in the book. And it's so much fun to work with all the authors and really get the stories and poems polished up. And authors are usually so wonderful to work with and want their stuff to be the best it can be. And it becomes almost a magical thing where the pieces come together into one complete book, whereas before they weren't together, and I can place them in different ways together, and they reflect differently from each other that way, and it's just really fun.
So there's a lot of choice that goes into the sequence of the stories in the anthology.
Yes, and that's the last step in the process, and I always look forward to that part, because once everything's put together and edited and ready to go, I just lay them all out on my dining room table. I expand it to the full length, and I lay them out, and I just put them together in different ways until it feels right. I kind of look for which piece would start off the book well, which would be a good second one, where do we want to end off, and then I kind of fill in the middle from there.
Great.
Fun.
Thanks for elucidating the process a little bit. Have you worked with an editor in completing the Siren dialogue?
I have recently, actually.
What's it
the
like
audience?
for an editor to work with an editor?
I love it because I really appreciate the role of an editor, being one, and you can't be your own editor. Much as I've tried, you need that outside eye. So I have my critique group, who've been invaluable, and I did have an editor look at it recently and give me some tips, because I'm going into my final revision before the book does go to the publisher, where I have to hand it off and not grab it back again. So it's good just to get an overview of what's going on, where do you see places that can be improved and streamlined and made more concrete, because my work tends to be very poetic and